Well, I'm just getting the final coats of some finish on 3 half-hull models that I've just completed. Now in this episode, which is going to be the part 1 of half-hull models, we're going to do a very basic model, and that will be of the tender Victoria. In the second part, we will be doing a little more complex one at an intermediate level, which will be the Herreshoff 12.5. And then we'll finish off in the third part with a more complex model of the Dark Harbor. So let's get started with the tender Victoria. Many of you had asked in your comments if there is a way that I could show how to build a half-hull model without the use of a bandsaw or any large stationary tools. So what I thought I'd do is to build the tender this time using some very basic tools. So we will need one power tool, and that is a jigsaw or oscillating saw like this. It's nice to have a small plane, like a block plane. I have 3 chisels here, a 3/4 inch flat chisel and a couple of gouges. At minimum, I think you'd probably need at least 1 gouge and 1 flat chisel. And then this, I think, is probably one of the best tools that is not really expensive. It's a Shinto Saw Rasp. So there are these saw blades that are on here, and one side is coarse and one side is fine. Now this rasp comes in a couple of different varieties. This is the more expensive one, where you can actually change the blades and put new blades on it. There is one that the blade just comes out of the handle and you just flip it over back and forth. And I think it maybe is about $10 cheaper. I'll put a link to this in the description below. I think right now it runs somewhere around $32. Very, very handy tool. I have some riffle files here also. Not necessary, but it certainly makes it a little easier. Now, if you don't want to invest in a rasp like this, a simple 4-in-hand rasp like this one that any hardware store sells, and they're generally in the $6 range, something like that. 4-in-hand because this side is slightly curved and this side is flat, and then there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different varieties on there. So of course, a coarse and a fine. It's always good to have a square and a measuring tool, and of course a pencil. So that's basically the basic tools. We're going to get started building the tender. Now, from the last video, many of you were interested in getting patterns for the tender. So what I did was I developed a pattern for that, and you can get this for free. Now, the way I've decided to do that, since I don't have an e-commerce site, I decided what I do is provide it for free on my Patreon account. So anybody at the $5 or above level will be able to get a free digital copy of these patterns. Now, I developed it so it would all fit exactly on a regular size piece of poster board. So to get started with our print, what we need to do is to attach the paper to something a little more substantial. And what I usually do is I put it on a piece of poster board. So I've got a piece of poster board here, and instead of spray mounting the back side of this entirely and then try to get it lined up and put on there, what I would suggest doing is to first cut out one lift at a time and spray mount that. So that's what we'll do first here, is we'll cut the first lift. And if I line it up where it came off of the print, then I know I'll have enough poster board to put all of them on there. So I'm going to go ahead and do each one of these individually. Now I've got all of the lift patterns dry mounted, spray mounted to this poster board. Now the one thing you do not need to spray mount to the poster board is this, where it shows the different lifts and how long they need to be. So this is just for a reference. It is not a pattern. So now what we need to do is to cut these patterns out. And what I would suggest doing is using a straight edge. Use a straight edge to cut the straight parts. That part cut, we can take our scissors then and cut out the lift. So now we have a nice solid piece of pattern that we can trace onto our wood. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of these cut out, and then we'll get ready to prepare the patterns on the wood. So here are all of our patterns laid out. Now, you may be wondering what these two little profile ones are for. And we've got two marks here, a center mark and a fore station mark. So what these are for is to be able to check the profile of the model like this. And then of course this one is for the front here at the fore station, which is about right there. Okay, so that's what those are. They're just little reference guides. And of course these lifts are the layers of the boat laid out here. So we're starting with lift 1, which is at the bottom, and then we work our way up 2, 3, 4, and then 5 is this little short piece, which wise we have a little short piece there. So if all of this is a little confusing, I would suggest watching the video prior to this, where I explain how lifts come about from a line plan. So we're ready to start putting our lifts and laying them out onto the lumber. So I've got here a couple of pieces of Honduras mahogany, and I've already milled it down to 3/4 of an inch. And these actual pieces are exactly 4 inches wide. If you're buying a piece of wood, you need at least a minimum of 4 feet, and the total length should be somewhere around 5 feet. So what I've done is I've already trimmed these off so that the lifts will fit on here in sort of an efficient manner. So the first board here, I'm going to lay out a couple of lifts, and I've already laid these out so I kind of know how they're going to go. I did that before I actually cut the piece. All right, so we've got them all laid out, and you can see why I squared the boards up here, because that way the lifts are nice and clean on there. So the next step to do is to trace out the lifts on here. You can see I did it this way so that I could sort of use the economy of not using lumber I don't need. And the last one is right here. Now the next thing I need to do is, where I have these station marks on here, I need to transfer those to the edge of the board. So I start here with lift number 4, put a little tick mark right here, and then there's one at the fore end right there. And once I get those marked, then I want to square that up. And then I'm going to put a little tick mark on the top here so that I have a reference to see. All right, and I'm going to do the same thing for this board here, and then we'll get ready to cut them out. All right, I've got the material all laid out here, and I've got it clamped down with a bench dog. Now, if you don't have a bench dog, a couple of clamps will also work, but it's important that the piece is very well secured. So I'm going to start by cutting out this little, the little lift here, number 5. So one of the things about cutting with a jigsaw like this is, if you can see here that the grain is running this direction. So when I'm going sort of the direction of the grain like this as opposed to against it, I get a much cleaner cut. Well, you can see here where I went against the grain, I get a much rougher cut. Now that's not nearly as important if you're using a bandsaw. That it doesn't matter because the blade is going through as opposed to cutting upward, which is what a jigsaw or a little saber saw like this does. So in knowing that, what I'm going to do for lift 2 is I'm going to start in the middle here and come out this way and then come back that way. So I've got all the lifts cut out now. Now the next step is to trim up the edges of it so that it's nice and square and fair. I don't know if you can see this, but I've left just a little bit of the pencil line. So to do this, we're going to use a block plane and just go across it. Just trim that up right to the pencil line. Now, of course, since this side, I was going with the grain, like I had mentioned before. So this side, I can now turn it over and do the other side the other way. Now it's okay to leave a little bit of the pencil line since we're going to be removing material anyway, but we want to make sure that it has a nice fair curve to it. So I'm going to do the rest of them and then we'll get ready to glue them up. Now I've got all of the lifts cleaned up here. So now we can use this lift template to see how our lifts line up. So remember I made that little tick mark. So lift 1 goes right there. And then lift 2. And 3. And 4. And then 5 will go right out here like that. So now we have the orientation of all of our lifts. What we can do is start to glue them together. Now one of the things that I have here is a little jig in order to do that. Now my preferred method is to put little nails in there so that the lifts don't shift around on me. But I wanted to show this method because it is a pretty common method amongst half-hull modelers. And basically what it is it's, you can see it's a couple of pieces of plywood that are cut at a clean 90-degree angle. I put a little tape on there so that the glue won't stick to it. And then these lifts will go on here like so, and you can see there's space underneath here so that you can clamp it easily. So what we do is to start with the first lift, which is number 1 right here. And we'll get some glue on there. And if you've seen me in the past I like using these spreaders because as opposed to a brush, it really puts an equal amount of glue on the lift the way you want it to be. But you can get the glue on there however way you want. If you want to use your finger, go right ahead. Okay, so the trick now is, you see on the back side here, where the registration marks are, we want to line these marks up like that. And give it a little bit of a wiggle so that it bonds, and then make sure that they're all nice and tight up against the upright here. And then we do the next one. This would be lift number 3. Turn around so you can see. Give it a little smush there. And the last lift, we don't need to spread across the whole thing, of course, because we just have this little piece. This is lift number 5. Now this is the reason why we have a registration mark up at the front, so that those can line up. And what I can do, since this is over, is I can slide this over so that I have that butted up against there nice and tight. And now what we need to do is put some clamps on here. And while I'm looking at the back of it, so that I know that I stay in registration, I'm going to put one clamp right in the middle. Be really careful here because they really do want to slide around. Glue really makes it pretty slippery. I'll put another one on. I suppose once you get to a certain point, you could put a clamp on this way so that it'll stay tight against the form. So now we want to put enough clamps on there that we get some good squeeze out. All right, there we go, all glued up. You can take this off of here actually. You can see we can take it off of the form, and what we can do now, very carefully so it doesn't shift around on us, is we can clean up some of this glue. So I've got the lifts out of the clamps now, and now the next thing we need to do is to cut the profile of the half hull. So in order to do that, we've got this pattern that comes along with your kit, and we'll line that up with the center line here, and then we're going to mark that out. So now I've got it drawn out here, I can cut the radius here pretty easily with my jigsaw. Now the problem is I cannot cut it back here, so you can see the blade doesn't go through the whole way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this with the jigsaw, the curved part, and then back here I'm going to make some straight lines like this, and then I'm going to cut that with a handsaw, cut off this that's straight. And then along here where I've got a curve, same thing, it's too thick. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to make a series of kerf cuts through here so that I'll be able to chisel that out. So now that I've got all those kerf cuts in there, I'm just going to take my chisel and chisel that out. Now that I've got the profile and the shear all smoothed out, I can start working on carving it. Now, in full disclosure, I made one of my kerf cuts a little too deep, almost about right in here. So I adjusted the shear down just a little bit and basically a little bit off the whole thing. Because it's a presentation model, it really doesn't matter that much. How it looks is far more important than how it's going to function. So you can see I attached a block to the back here so that that can sit into the vise here, nice and tight. And now it's a matter of starting to carve it. And what I want to do is to interpret from each one of these inner joints in here, and curve it round. So this is actually some of the fun part, at least for me, I think, is to get carving it and start shaping it and sculpting it. Mallet. So as we're working on the stern here, we can put the stern pattern on there and mark that out. And that way we know that that's the line that we're carving to. I've got the majority of it roughed out now, and I think I'd mentioned that this file has some real rough teeth on one side and finer teeth on the other. So I flipped it over, and so I'm going to start going over the whole thing now with the finer teeth. I've got it all sanded down now to 220 grit, and the last thing that we need to do is to put the skeg on. I cut a small piece of mahogany about 3/16 of an inch thick, or 5 millimeters, and then used the pattern to get the proper angle on the aft end and used the model to scribe the curve. That's it for this half-haul model of the small tender Victoria. Now, the next thing to do is put a finish on it, and you could put the finish of your choice on it. I personally like lacquer finishes, mainly because they dry quickly and you can sand very nicely in between them and really build up a nice coat. But you could also use a spar varnish or oil. You could even stain it if you wanted it to be a little darker. So anyway, that would be your choice. Anyway, the next project will be to work on the Herreshoff 12.5. I just put a coat of paste wax on the model. And I've got probably about 15 coats of lacquer on here, and then I sanded very lightly in between each one and ended up using maybe about 400 grit on the last several coats. By adding this wax on there then, I think it gives it a really nice hand-rubbed finish. So that's it for this episode. I hope you'll join me in part 2 where we tackle that Herreshoff 12.5. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and remember, if you're going to make it beautiful.